Today, we're talking about quite possibly the sexiest camera I've ever used. The Contax G1 is the latest addition to my worryingly quickly growing camera collection, but this is one that I'm really quite excited about. Today, I'm going to give you my first impressions of this beautiful Contax G1. Now for this first impressions video, I'm going to break it down into three categories: build quality, usability, and image quality. And I'll talk about a few things within each category. So let's start with build quality. The Contax G series of cameras are luxury 35mm autofocus rangefinder cameras made of titanium, and this Contax G1 is one of the most well-built cameras that I've ever used. It weighs 460 grams without batteries, feels slim and lightweight in your hand without ever feeling anything short of luxury. Its younger brother and arguably more popular and famous camera, the Contax G2, is a slightly bigger camera and weighs 560 grams without batteries. But the Contax G1 feels incredibly well built and incredibly balanced in the hand, and for me is the perfect size and weight for a daily carry camera. The little extended grip on the front feels great in the hand in both portrait and landscape orientations. The viewfinder protruding slightly off the back of the camera allows for it to comfortably come up to your eye and sit just on top of your nose. The viewfinder itself is nice and bright and easy to look through, and with a built-in diopter, it's super easy to get it sharp for your eyesight. It does flare a little bit in direct sunlight, but that's been my experience for the majority of viewfinders that I've used. The dials are all neatly placed on top of the camera and feel sturdy and super satisfying, and if you need to change any settings, everything is easily accessible from this top-down view of the camera. The shutter speed and exposure compensation dial turns super smoothly with hard stops for each shutter speed available, and a lock between manual and auto exposure, which you need to press the little button in the center of the dial to navigate between exposure modes. The buttons for setting a manual ISO and changing the shooting mode on the top left of the camera are super responsive and super easy to use, and on the 28mm lens that I have, the aperture turns smoothly and really easily too. My only slight issues with the build quality of the camera come mainly as a personal preference. The focus wheel of the camera is on top of the body as opposed to being on a lens, and it's pretty easy to turn and move. Now, I've only shot the camera in the autofocus mode, and that clicks satisfyingly into place and requires the press of a button in the center of the dial to once again change out into the manual focus mode. The camera is very much designed to be used as an autofocus camera, but if I did want to shoot any street photography and zone focus, or if I was shooting landscapes and wanted to be locked into infinity, I'd be a little scared that I'd accidentally jog the focus wheel very easily and change my focusing zone. It would have been nice to be able to lock that manual focus wheel and make the manual focusing of the camera a little bit easier. And then finally, my last issue is potentially just a fault with my specific camera and not Contax G1's as a whole, but the half press of the shutter to get focus feels really short, and I have to put such little pressure on the button in order to half press. It makes it quite easy to fully depress the shutter button, and that could easily lead to some focusing issues and accidental taking of images. When I gave the camera to my friends, they didn't really understand the half press. They were experienced with cameras and had used them before, so they knew what a half press felt like, but to them they couldn't really tell the difference. But pretty much everything as a whole just feels super premium and luxury and makes the camera an absolute joy to use. And of course, the camera is one of the best looking cameras that I've ever seen, let alone shot with. The aesthetics, of course, are a purely personal thing and have absolutely no bearing on the images that the camera can produce, but if a good looking camera is something that you for some reason hold as a highly important factor, the Contax G series and Contax cameras as a whole are definitely something to look at. So let's move on to usability. I've only shot 4 rolls through the camera, mainly just to test it out and to see what sort of imagery can be produced, not with the aim of taking anything portfolio building or serious images that are designed to be anything other than a test. And 2 of these rolls were shot with me and my friends just testing out a flash unit on a little day out, so don't take the images too super seriously. But I have to say that using the camera in a fully automatic mode is an absolute breeze. The camera's designed to be used as a fully automatic rangefinder with auto exposure, which is essentially aperture priority, and autofocus. But if you wanted to, you can shoot the camera fully manually with both manual exposure and manual focus, or obviously mix and match however you like. The G1 reads DX coded films and so automatically sets the ISO of the film. However, if you want to shoot at a different speed to the box speed of the film stock of your choice, it's super simple to change. Just hold down the ISO button on the left hand side of the camera and use the two buttons there to toggle up or down to your chosen ISO and half press the shutter to select it. Simple as that. I've only ever shot single photo drive mode, but it's easy to toggle between those modes over on the left of the camera too if you wanted to shoot continuously at 2 frames per second or with a self timer. As I pointed out earlier, it's also super easy to use exposure compensation with the dial on the right hand side of the camera. Using the shutter speed dial in the auto position will expose correctly for the ISO that you have selected over on the left hand side, and you can add or take away exposure compensations in third stop increments up to 2 stops of over and under exposure. The meter in the camera is center weighted and I've found in general works perfectly fine and takes an accurate reading, but like with any camera, it's always handy to learn to use exposure compensation for scenarios like a backlit subject or where your subject is far brighter than the surroundings. The viewfinder also does display the chosen shutter speed corresponding to whichever aperture you've chosen and will flash with an up or down arrow if it believes the shot will be under or over exposed. There's a small window next to the shutter button that shows how many shots you've taken, and that window is always on, so you don't have to turn the camera on to see how many shots you've got left in your roll. I've actually found that every roll that I've shot through the camera, it squeaked out 37 shots, so you're getting that extra shot per roll most of the time. It's super easy to load, automatically winds up to the first shot, and does of course automatically advance each shot after you've taken it. And it also auto rewinds at the end of the roll so that it's ready to send off to a lab or develop at home. And there's also a window on the back so that you can of course see what film you have loaded. So onto one of the biggest contentions surrounding the Contax G1 and the G series as a whole, the usability of the autofocus. Now I did have some images from the rolls that I've shot so far come back slightly out of focus, but I have a feeling that a lot of them were probably from a lack of care on my part when focusing, and they were never completely out of focus, just missed by a couple of inches or so, so in some scenarios somewhat usable. The G1 focuses using the center of the frame in a pretty clear AF point and calculates the distance needed for focus from what is in that center AF point. So if you wanted to focus on something not in the center of your composition, you simply have to frame your subject in the center, half press the shutter to get focus, recompose, and then fully press the shutter to shoot, which with my scenario is a little bit tricky sometimes with the half press that doesn't always feel as if it's been pressed. In general, it's not a super hard way of shooting, but can definitely be different from a lot of other autofocus systems that you may be used to. And because it's a rangefinder, you can't actually tell what the camera is focused on through the viewfinder. The closest guide that you have is a pretty handy distance scale in the viewfinder. When you half press the shutter to focus, if the camera finds something to focus on, a small indicator pops up on the distance scale at the distance at which the lens is focused. If the camera can't focus on anything, these indicators blink at either end of the scale, showing you that nothing will be in focus. I found the autofocus to actually be a quite simple way of shooting, and I found it to be fairly reliable and quick. In bright situations, my G1 found focus very quickly, and it seemed from the final images very accurately as well. I think on a few occasions I may have not been as careful as I needed to be to compose my subject directly in the center to get a precise focus, but that's not an issue with the camera, more a user error that I imagine would be smoothed out with more shooting the more I get used to the camera. The autofocus definitely isn't perfect, but I found it to be far better than a lot of reviews online had previously stated, and what had sort of scared me from buying the camera in the first place. As I said earlier in the video, I would love to be able to use the camera in a manual focus scenario with zone focusing, but the lack of a lock on the quite easy to move focus dial on top of the camera does make that a little bit difficult. And to add to that, the lens actually refocuses back to infinity after every shot, and so it doesn't stay in whatever focus distance you've set the dial to. So if you wanted to quickly snap something using zone focusing in like a street scenario, you have to wait for the lens to focus back on your set area before snapping the shot. Again, another issue that makes me just far less likely to use manual focus with the G1. And that really is the only gripe and issues that I had shooting with the Contax G1. I found it super easy to shoot with and a very enjoyable experience as a whole. It's perfect for taking out as a daily carry, snapping photos of your everyday life, but also I can think of many professional situations where I'd be happy to shoot with this camera. So, onto arguably the most important part of the video, what is the image quality like? from the Contax G1. Well, I can comfortably say that the images I've gotten out of this little camera, despite only being test photos and nothing too serious, are some of the highest quality images I've got out of a 35mm film. A large part of what makes the 35mm negatives that this camera produces so great is because of the Carl Zeiss lenses available. The images that I got back were only of a medium resolution according to the lab, smaller than some of the other scans I've got back, and the sharpness of these lenses is honestly incredible. At 28mm, the lens that I have obviously is not going to produce incredible bokeh and shallow depth of field, but does give a pretty satisfactory level of depth to the image when shot wide open. The contrast of the lens and the way that it registers tones is very pleasing to my eye, and on the whole I'm super happy with the results that I've got so far. For me, it's probably the closest that I've got to 120 film to medium format quality on a 35mm camera. It's not comparable and it's not the exact same, but the sharpness and quality of the lenses and the depth and just the general tones that I've felt it produce is closer to medium format than any other 35mm camera that I've used. In conclusion, I absolutely love the Contax G1. It's just a joy to shoot with and feels super easy to get some really quite incredible 35mm results. I've only had this camera since being in lockdown, essentially in England. We've had pretty terrible weather and I've been super busy with work, so I haven't been able to shoot nearly as much with it as I'd have liked, but I can't wait to take the camera out for more serious trips and take some amazing photos with it. Hopefully with some nice weather and when I'm allowed to actually travel to some places to take more interesting photos than just my quite mundane local area. That's it for this video. If you own a Contax G1 and have any thoughts, or if you're thinking about buying one, please do feel free to leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed the video, I would love for you to subscribe, leave a like, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.